what's next in rare disease data collection and clinical use. And I'd like to take this moment to invite up on stage Dr. Stephen Bedrick, Dr. Manish Butte, and Dr. Janet Woodcock. Well, I think there's going to be a little bit of an AI connection threading through these three talks, but there's some other topics to be covered about rare disease data collection, use, and other things. We're going to have three speakers. Again, we're going to have about 12 minutes for each presentation, and Katie will hold up a sign, a 10-minute mark, and then we'll have group discussion. The first speaker is going to be Dr. Bedrick, who is Associate Professor of Medical Informatics and Clinical Epidemiology at Oregon Health Science University.
Right. Well, thank you everyone so much for the opportunity to be here. Brilliant. Okay. Oh, but I can't see the slides. That's going to be exciting. Okay. Well, the previous discussion basically covered about a third of what I'm going to be talking about. So that was an amazing Q&A panel just now. I'll be talking about electronic health records, artificial intelligence, and natural history phenotyping, what's new, what's different, and what's missing. And that looks a little bit different than it looked on my computer, so I hope it looks okay up there. I also wanted to start off by saying I know we have a lot of people here from FDA, NIH, ARPA-H. I just want to say a big thank you to all of our federal partners. We know it's been a few months, and we see you, we support you, we know you that you have all of our backs, and that's just sort of where we're at. So thank you for that. And so sort of in that vein, these are really wild times for clinical research. And I think there's two big things that are driving big shifts in clinical research over the last 10 or 15 years. And the first is widespread adoption of electronic health records. And then the second is new computational tools that help us do different things than we used to be able to do with EHR data. My sort of thesis here is that unstructured notes, we can kind of stop thinking of them as the graveyard of clinical data, where information goes to die and never be heard from again. But I will be complicating that a little bit in this presentation. So the life cycle of an EHR data point, right? A data point that we might be accessing as part of a clinical trial study data. We might have a provider who asks a patient a question about their smoking status. The patient says, no, I quit last year. They have a little discussion about it, right? And in the end, the provider writes something in the encounter note. They write down that this person quit smoking with, perhaps nicotine gum after, a certain amount of attempts, and then maybe write some social history stuff about what they're doing with their new lung capacity, right? And they write this down primarily so that next time when the patient comes in, and I apologize, the text, something went very badly wrong with the slides, so we'll just, hopefully that's legible. Next time they see the answer from that visit, they can ask about how they're doing, and maybe they ask about the dog, right? They're really documenting it to help them with their patient care. Now, what also gets recorded in the EHR might be structured data, right? It might get written down perhaps in a drop-down menu. I'm using smoking status as an example because in the US, all electronic medical records have to support structured data collection of smoking status. It's going to get recorded that Alice is now a former smoker. It's going to be entered in the database using a well-structured terminology that other hospitals might be also using, so that'll facilitate data integration down the road. Maybe there's some other data about when the smoking cessation happened. And but notice what's not there is nothing about the dog, nothing about what Alice thinks about having stopped smoking. None of that other stuff makes it there. So we can say that the structured data is capturing a small piece. And of course, we've heard today about a number of different things that never make it to structured data at all. I love the green versus yellow bile example. from we heard earlier. So what's in that note is really, really, really important. And historically, we haven't really had access to that regularly from a research standpoint, right? Frequently, we don't have access to it. And the reasons, there's a few different reasons. They're very difficult to process computationally. We've heard about this a bit today already, certainly compared to a nice drop-down menu. Frequently, secondary data use repositories just don't include the unstructured notes at all, partly because people don't use them as much, partly for some of the other reasons we'll talk about, the privacy and security baggage that they come with, right? The drop-down menu of smoking status is one thing. The detailed discussion of the person's dog walking routine is a very different thing. And hospitals and patients and providers are often less comfortable sharing that information for obvious reasons. But that's also where the most crucial information comes in, right? Qualitative descriptions, physician impressions, family history, social history, all these complicated, important things that we might need, especially for use cases like identifying atypical presentations that might indicate a rare disease. And so where does that leave us? Well, over the last few years, computational technology has advanced dramatically. We've seen since 2019 in the popular media, right, increasing discussion about generative AI models, large language models. When they first started being discussed publicly outside of my own little weird field of computational linguistics, it was sort of as this abstract thing that might be a thing someday. Within a very small number of years, there was a common enough phenomenon that there were New York Times articles about how frightening they were. This was Kevin Roos's terrifying discussion where Microsoft's chatbot tried to convince him to leave his wife for the chatbot over the course of a conversation. Shortly, within to me, a remarkably short period of time, the news articles started being boring business news. And then later in 2024, things got weird. This is the PG version of this talk, so I'm not including the actual figure, but if you're curious, it made it into Frontiers. It was an AI-generated figure. Someone was fraudulently making data, and it went horribly, horribly wrong and should not have made it past peer review, but it was also hilarious. So if you're interested, Google it. And of course, we've seen just in the last week even more bizarre things. The fraudulent HHS report that used made-up citations to make fraudulent claims about healthcare, right? So we're kind of living in this weird situation. But I'm not going to dwell on that because these tools, in addition to making strange images of rats and fraudulent claims about healthcare, also are amazing tools for analyzing EHR notes for things like chart review and extraction, right? So pulling out medication history, phenotypic descriptions, all of these things, that process of structuring that unstructured data, LLMs have really changed how we do it. I mean, I've been doing this since 2012 is when I finished my PhD. And just in the last 2 or 3 years, the things that we never thought would be possible, in terms of how much data we would need are really amazing. So this is the category of stuff that we always used to do, but now it actually works a lot better, which is amazing. It's very, very, very cool. I'm kind of a proud Luddite. I still drive a stick shift car and buy CDs, but I'm legitimately excited about some of the use cases we're finding for these technologies. And then the other thing we can do with them is a lot of sort of extracting data, not just as single data points, but then combining them into, filling out assessments or identifying, how many different things were mentioned in the note, kind of slightly higher level reasoning. They're very, very good for that. This was occasionally feasible historically, but usually I would have to tell partners and collaborators, that's not really what we can do. Now we're being able to, which is just really exciting. The most important thing to know is that in the past, this sort of project would typically require a great deal of new data collection and annotation, which is of course very expensive. And the new large language model tools make it way easier to get by with less of that, which is very exciting. So in some ways, electronic health records and LLMs are like peanut butter and jelly or John and Yoko, like they go really, really well together. But there are some big issues that we need to discuss that don't get discussed very often. So I've got some like hazard warnings here. So the idealized information flow that people who talk about LLMs and EHRs envision is something like this. The patient has a health event, they see their provider, the provider puts stuff in the EHR, the LLM accesses that data and does stuff with it, right? That is skipping a lot of really important steps, unfortunately. In this scenario, the LLM is being kind of conceived of as an accurate and complete data source. And we just heard a wonderful discussion about some of the ways that's maybe not always the case. And so here's perhaps a less idealized information flow. The patient experiences a health event of some kind. They access care. They have some kind of interaction with the provider, who then makes some kind of documentation decisions. Um, at somewhere along the line, that data leaves the EHR to some kind of source for secondary use, perhaps like the All of Us repository that we heard about earlier, an institutional repository of some kind, and then ultimately it goes to an LLM. And each of those steps has things that can happen that are going to affect the ultimate utility down the road. So the first step, right, the patient has their experience, but then they have to actually decide to seek care. Right. And we know that there's a lot of things patients won't seek care for. I'm not picking on my boomer father here, but going to the doctor is not the favorite thing. So do they want to seek care? Do they actually go seek care? Then, of course, they have to have care available, right? And what care do they have available? What do they actually be able to access? And if you're familiar with the Swiss cheese model of medical or aviation disasters, where we have pieces of Swiss cheese and the holes represent gaps in different, guidelines or protections, and aviation accidents happen when like 10 different things all line up. We have the reverse Swiss cheese situation when it comes to AI in healthcare, where all the holes have to line up just right for information to actually make it to the other side. So our first layer of Swiss cheese is the patient going to get care, accessing care, and making it out there. Then, what do they choose to tell their provider? What does the patient know how to tell the provider? I was talking with someone the other day who spent a couple of years complaining to her doctor about weakness in her right hand, and it kept testing just fine. And then one day she, in further conversation with the doctor, discovered that she should have been describing it as a loss of dexterity in her right hand, and suddenly they knew exactly what was wrong with her. And so this can be a matter of health literacy, it can be a matter of a language barrier, it can be a lot of different things. And so, and my cheese is coming in at the wrong time, I apologize. What does the provider actually hear and understand of what the patient's telling them? What do they consider clinically important? I love the thing that came up in the discussion earlier about what does the patient then actually think to ask, or what does the provider ask the patient? Then, what do they choose to put in the what do they choose to document? We heard some good reasons why they may or may not choose to document different things. What do they actually successfully document? And then, here we get to technical matters. What does the EHR make possible to document? What are their drop-down menus for? What is complicated and challenging to document? And then at what level can they document it? Finally, we have the similar sets of questions. What actually makes it into the repository? And then we get to start arguing about things like that AI researchers like to argue about what LLMs are good for, how well will it work with the patient-specific issues, has it ever seen patients with a rare disease before, which one do we get to use, do we use Microsoft or Google, all those kinds of questions that AI researchers like to argue about. So if this is our model, most of the current discourse on AI in medicine starts with that, right? We argue about this model is better than that model, or we got this score when we did this way, or that score with that way. And I feel like we ignore all of this. And that's really, really important. And then just one last point, if I go to the doctor, cisgender white man, and I complain about back pain, the doctor, I have a reasonable belief that they'll take me seriously and document it in a certain way. There's been a lot of research on how different people with different lived experiences experience the healthcare system and what gets written down. And every one of these steps can be impacted that way. Access to care, what doctors understand, what they're familiar with, what patients know about, all of that can affect it. So we talk a lot about social determinants of health in terms of outcomes. I'd also like to think about that in terms of legibility of health stuff to AI models and who's able to access benefits from the AI models that I was talking about earlier. So with that, I will not take questions. We'll do that at the end. But thank you very much for your attention. And those are too small to read, but if you're interested, there's some people who've written about some similar models to the one I just outlined for issues in data quality. So I'll leave it with that. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. That was wonderful. I'm going to forgive you for the badly timed cheese because it was really wonderful talking. So our next speaker is Dr. Manish Butte, who is professor and division chief of Immunology, Allergy, and Rheumatology at UCLA, one of the NORD Rare Disease Centers of Excellence. Manish and I also overlapped a little bit at Boston Children's Hospital. I was a genetics fellow when he was an allergy immunology fellow. Yeah. It was a pleasure to have him here.
Thank you for inviting me, and I'm really glad to be here at the inaugural meeting. This is super fun. I've already had a number of great discussions and looking for the rest of the day. No big disclosures. This work was funded by the NIH. Hopefully all of us recognize what that means and what that should mean in the future. I'm really grateful for supporting a very experimental project by NIAID for artificial intelligence. It's not something that we thought we would get funded, and we're excited now 3 years into this project. So the problem we're trying to solve in our world of inborn errors of immunity, sorry, I should introduce myself. I'm a pediatric immunologist, but I take care of a lot of adults with genetic immune diseases. These are, like you heard this morning from Lisa Forbes-Satter, inborn errors of immunity that may make the immune system overactive or underactive as people have infection susceptibility or autoimmunity driven by a monogenic and highly penetrant variant. And many of these patients tell us that they spend a decade having symptoms or more before they're actually diagnosed. These patients have recurrent infections and they're treated for their infections, and they have more infections, and no one actually says something's wrong with your immune system. They have autoimmunity and nobody says something underneath, something genetic is driving that. So what ends up happening is there are cumulative harms to the patient. Their lungs become scarred, their kidney function drops. By the time we can really diagnose them, many of them have a shortened lifespan, and I'll show you quantitatively what that means in a second. There's also a cost to the health system as these patients undergo their diagnostic journey. I don't need to tell all of you about how many tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars per year patients have to spend with emergency room visits, with extra scans, and blah, blah, blah. So the cost to the patients is definitely in terms of quality of life. In fact, we now have data, over a decade of data from both, on the left from Charlotte Cunningham-Rundle's group at Mount Sinai, and on the right from Freiburg in Germany, where patients who have complicated immunodeficiencies, where they have not just infections, IO, infection only instead, but also have autoimmunity, have a much shorter lifespan. We don't know who is going to be on which curve. So there's no pointer here, but so the top curve represents infection only, and those people are living almost as long as their peers, whereas the bottom one really represents those who have those extra complications, including autoimmunity. Some of these patients need aggressive treatment. Some of these patients need bone marrow transplant. We don't know how to decide it until they're too late. Sometimes they're too sick. And we hope that an AI tool might be able to find out which patients on which trajectory early and help us intervene earlier. Another problem we're trying to solve, and this echoes some of the previous talks you've heard about, we have 550 genetic immune diseases now that we have to take care of in our clinics. It is staggering how many disorders we have to teach our fellows about as they go through their training. There are not 550 distinct patterns of illness. In fact, there is no natural history to our diseases. For each patient is their own history. And yet we have to come up with pattern matching. That's what doctors do. That's how we try to come up with ways of making our lives a little bit easier. And we don't have any good sense of how those patterns are. If you asked me 5 years ago, I would say, and I teach all of our colleagues around the country to sequence their patients. We're doing that now. That's not enough. We have too many genes. And now, so we need pathways. So we tell people to think about drugging pathways and not just individual genes. We're lost. We don't know where the patterns are anymore. There are way too many genetic disorders. We've hit 550. We're on our way to about 2,500 genes that we think are going to be important for immunodeficiencies. What are the key lessons that we can learn from these genes, these patterns, and their clinical histories? We can't find them. I'll show you some data in a little bit. These patterns are indiscernible to humans, and we need AI to help us with that. Especially if you want to, again, be on a path to trajectory management. And so what we did early on in the 1980s was come up with a set of warning signs to help doctors identify these rare diseases. Who's had, you can't read the fonts underneath, but if you've had 2 or more pneumonias, 3 or more sinus infections, 2 or more IV antibiotics, et cetera, these are the sick, infection-sick patients. But many of these warning signs missed the newer features of immune dysregulation that we've come to recognize, like autoimmunity or allergies. So we had to build a better set of warning signs, which we're doing with AI. The way we do that is we take a bona fide group of patients and extract as much data as we can from them, their visits, their medicines, their lab tests, their ICD codes, et cetera, and try to come up with our own set of warning signs based on artificial intelligence, machine learning. The idea then is to apply that to undiagnosed patients who are coming to the hospital because they have some infection or autoimmunity, and ask, is this enough? Should this patient get a diagnosis of an immunodeficiency now so that we can start thinking about aggressively managing them earlier than we would have before? Let's not wait 10 years for the patient to get sick before we really can intervene, give them the treatments they need. So I'm going to cut to the chase. We published a paper last year in where we developed this method. We trained an AI on 186 patients at UCLA. We were able to identify patients now up to about 4 years earlier than the human diagnosed them. That is to say, if you go back in time in the medical records and march forwards, our AI would have been like, whoa, 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 don't go anymore. This patient probably has an immune deficiency now. And that would be 1, 2, 3, 4 years before the human had diagnosed them historically in the past. That's great. We want to go further back because we know we have to go back further in order to prevent some of the permanent scarring and damage to tissue. Can we find undiagnosed patients? The answer is yes. Oh my goodness, there's no way you can read this. But our method was to take this scoring system. It is and apply it to the UCLA database of 1 million patients and rank them from 1, most likely to have an immune deficiency, to 1 million, the patient least likely to have an immune deficiency. So like patient 1 million came to UCLA once with a sprained ankle or something. Whereas patient number 1 on the list might have a lot of autoimmune and infection features. And by rank ordering them, we took the top 100 off and blended them with 100 other age and sex match control patients. And we were able to show that those top 100 are highly enriched for patients with immunodeficiencies, about 5,000x times above random. So it's really was a very successful method. And this is what, for example, the training data looks like. So I'm sorry. Only the ones in the front can see it, but the top things say things like lymphadenitis, thrombocytopenia, splenomegaly, hepatomegaly, pancytopenia, ulcerative colitis. These are inflammatory and autoimmune features of our diseases. In the middle are infections. You can see chronic sinusitis, bronchiectasis, diarrhea. Each vertical line is 1 patient in the training data. And so you can see some patients had both diarrhea and autoimmunity, sinus infections and thrombocytopenia. But no one feature is pathognomonic for these diseases. There is no natural history for our diseases. Each patient has their own trajectory through autoimmune and infection space. And how do we find patterns in this is what our AI did. And so we thought we'd be able to just refer them to clinic, right? Our AI says, come to clinic. You scream like you have an immune deficiency based on your chart, come to clinic. But it didn't work out like that. It actually, oh God, this didn't format well. It didn't work out like that at all. We weren't allowed to contact the patients directly. We had to go through an honest broker and go through their current doctor. 50% of the doctors we contacted were like, no, I don't think my patient has an immune deficiency. I'm an esteemed pulmonologist. I know what an immune deficiency is. I think you might be wrong on that one. And so they would throw that away. When we actually brought the patients in or manually reviewed their charts, we saw they had other disorders like cancer or cystic fibrosis or lupus, which can be confounders because a lot of those patients have the same kind of infections and autoimmunity as our patients do. We've taught our AI subsequently how to do that, but how to solve for that. But these are iterative processes. It has taken us about 3 years to get to this point. Then we bring them to clinic. We do whole genome sequencing and RNA sequencing on everybody. And we've found some cool patients. Like here's one from the University of California, Irvine, our sister institution to the south. We do this, by the way, on all 5 University of Californias at once because we have a shared OMOP data set. This is the second time today you're hearing the word OMOP. OMOP is that shared common data standard that allows all of our health record systems to talk to each other. And we have that at University of California. So we used it. We found this 22-year-old with recurrent infections, but also had very low B cells. And she also had an enlarged spleen and lymph nodes. Oops. She had almost no B cells, almost no B cell development. They were all trapped as naive B cells, and they had all these markers of immaturity in her B cell development. This is for the immunologists in the crowd, maybe I might be the only one left here. This is a very abnormal phenotype. And we ended up sequencing her genome. We found this interesting variant in this gene. I'm not saying she has this disorder, but this is a very rare variant. It is predicted to be pathogenic. It has a very low allele frequency, blah, blah, blah. It also fits phenotypically in very nicely. So we're trying to validate this as potentially the cause of her disease and a new genetic disease. So the idea is that we can find these patients and we can sequence them and find new genes. But one thing we found as we look through these patients, hundreds and hundreds of charts, is that they're not as severe as we think like our index patients are. Our index patients are very sick. These patients aren't. And this is kind of a problem. Like, where do rare diseases start to blend into the general population? Where is autoimmunity that like these people have different from rare disease autoimmunity, right? Like we have to draw a line somewhere, do we or don't we? And this is becoming very hard for us because we are sequencing everybody and we're finding variants. And for example, these are variants that you see on the screen here that are not that rare. They're rare. They're FDA rare, of course. I wouldn't do anything that's not FDA rare. But beyond that, like, isn't it too common to have a gene that's a variant that's found in 1 in 1,000 people? Are we really talking about rare diseases if they're that common? So as we start to broaden our sense and phenotypic diversity of what these rare genetic diseases are, you have to start building a whole new model, software and training, to help us think about what general autoimmunity is. Is it a rare-ish variant plus polygenic risk? Like, we're trying to build a sense of that, and we're nowhere near that point. This is definitely something that we want to try to tackle next with our AI. But here's an example of a variant called CARD 11848C. First described by Andy Snow, where in a cohort of patients with an ultra-rare genetic disorder called Benta, there's only 30 patients in America with it, but this came up in his cohort. It is a overactivating a mutation in B cells and T cells, but it's not that rare. It's about 1 in 4,000, 1 in 8,000 South Asians carries it, 1 in 4,000 East Asians carry it in another data set. Yeah. So we don't know how to find these rare variants in these genes. We're trying to do methods like CRISPR screening to look for it, but we can't find patterns in the data. This is still too hard for us. So to wrap up, I think we should be using AI to mine the electronic health records, as we're already doing, come up with phenotypic scores for them, and bring genotype and sequencing to all of them, and try to build a model for how to think about rare diseases and semi-rare diseases and maybe not so rare diseases using AI, because this is really where we're headed in my field. Anyway, thank you. So I want to credit, we collaborate with a computer science group at Penn. He was at UCLA, Bogdan Pasnuik's group. He's at Penn now. And then a bunch of people at UCLA, really super important to our work. And then we have a collaboration across all the UCs. Thank you.
Thanks, Manish. I'm glad you have at least something that looks like a fact sorting plot. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a real immunology talk, right? Our next speaker is Dr. Janet Woodcock. I think very many of you will know Janet. She served as director of the CDER for drug evaluation and research of the FDA for a considerable period of time, led a number of important initiatives in FDA, and also served as acting commissioner of the FDA for a term. She's going to talk, I think, about at least 3 areas.
5. Okay. Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me. Sorry, I still have a residual chest cold here. So I want to talk about 5 areas where I think AI can really help us. And these are the 5 Ds. Okay. So drug discovery, drug development, drug approval, diagnosis of rare diseases, and dissemination of the findings, which is also a sore point here, to get people to actually prescribe interventions when they have gone through this entire process. So discovery, I was really surprised, despite my long career in drug development, that so many drugs actually probably can be repurposed for new diseases. And why is this important? Because they're already out there. And so they don't have to go through a lot of the excruciating time, often, especially if they're approved for something else. They've already had toxicology and patient experience and all this stuff. FDA, I helped start something called Cure ID. It was for infectious disease, and it relied upon doctors to report success with rare infectious diseases. And some of you may have read in the Washington Post how a little girl with a rare amoeba infection in her brain was saved by this program, which identified a possible alternative, which she was given, and which she then survived her infection. This, unfortunately, Cure ID currently relies upon doctors to enter the information. Well, that's very limited. And so trolling through the EHRs and having AI find these cases and present them as signals, maybe, this should be worked up as a possibility, I think could really improve things. On the other hand, I'm working with a group called EveryCure, and they are using AI to match all the pathways known to man up with all the syndromes and what pathways the drugs work on compared to the pathways the syndromes are believed to be involved in, and putting those together and then working up potential and then bring in all the medical literature and so forth to get candidates. And many of these are for rare diseases. And the reason I think this is so helpful is they've already had success And if this were rare, a rare phenomenon, this wouldn't have worked. But this is probably just the tip of the iceberg. There are probably a lot of drugs out there that can help these rare diseases. But we're going to need to use artificial intelligence to find them. Drug development, I'm working on something called N of 1 for rare genetic diseases. We are trying to get a new regulatory pathway that is process regulation rather than product regulation, because for the same chemistry, you're not going to apply and get a new drug application for one person to treat one person. I mean, it's absurd. Okay, these processes were put together for large populations and standard drug development. So we need to move to a different system for these individualized therapies, whether that is ASOs or CRISPR, gene editing of different sorts and so forth, because they're going to be different for every different kind of mutation, as we already heard. And every individual becomes, as you look closer, they become more and more unique. So this is going to require AI algorithms and a lot of standardization and so forth on the design and of these products and so forth. So, but I would like to try to get a process where there's a process approval, so there could be reimbursement for these new technologies, because that's really important, obviously. Now, drug approval. I don't know what was talked about this morning. I wish I were here, but I can tell you for very rare diseases, or even pretty rare diseases, the RCT is probably not fit for purpose, okay, mathematically. You can't, especially with a lot of heterogeneity in symptoms, as you heard about, which is often the case in rare diseases, you won't find a signal. You won't find the benefit in an RCT. And I think that's what we've seen for many of the failures that we have seen, is companies have done RCTs and they don't find anything. And this, with P less than 0.05, this is not surprising. There are other designs, the Bayesian designs, the sequential N of 1 designs could be used. And here modeling and simulation is really important, and maybe constructing external control groups based on what we have information from registries or the electronic health record and so forth. So I'm working on that as well. Drug diagnosis. Okay, that's the next one. You can tell me if I'm running out of time here. Okay. Now, I think it was really important what we heard about the Swiss cheese. Okay. I have been working on a project to build using a large language model, but other things on top of that, to build by patients for patients, something that will serve the patient. Because it is absolutely true, and you already said it, okay, that what people tell a doctor, that may not be what the doctor hears. And actually, when you're in a doctor's office, and it happens to me and to everybody, okay, and you're sick, you freeze up. And you can hardly talk, right? And they're busy doing their stuff. And this leads to a lot of misdiagnosis. So I've been working on a tool that patients can use, but would be built by patients, so that you understand the patient, how the lived experience of the person is expressed, and then translates that into doctor language. So you can go look at the large language model and can do the pattern recognition and give you a differential diagnosis. Same with navigation of the healthcare system. Once you get this diagnosis, we need something. Everybody's building stuff for the doctors in the clinic and billing. Nobody's building anything for patients. And that's really the biggest gap that we have and what leads in many cases to prolonged delays in diagnosis. However, with the recent problems in the market and everything, this project has been put on hold, and I'm working on trying to get it restarted again and get the investment. But if I don't build it, somebody else is going to do it eventually, because we can't have all this agentic AI working for the healthcare system and have the patients out there just trying to to talk to people and trying to explain what's wrong with them. I mean, I had the same experience as you described. My eye doctor, when I told him about this, he said, yeah, when I trained at Tulane, the patients would come in. This is local vernacular. They'd say, my doc, my eye pains me. It pains me really bad. Well, they meant they had blurry vision. And it took forever for the ophthalmologist to figure this out, right? But that was just how that was expressed. And we can capture all that if we do the right thing and have patience. Learn the patient's language about their lived experience and then support them in their healthcare journey, not just supporting the healthcare system. I mean, who's the client here, honestly? And then finally, dissemination. What really is painful is that even once treatments are discovered, they aren't disseminated out. The doctors are too busy, they don't read the literature and so forth. People always are unhappy about drug company detailing, going out and talking to doctors, but in some ways that's the only way to get adoption right now. Now, I think AI and the use of the electronic health record and that is going to help, and the clinical decision support will help the doctors. And I think that's the way it's going to have to be done, okay, is to provide those options for the clinician, because detailing has its problems and so forth, but hopefully AI could be unbiased and simply offer, here's the standard of care, because many people with cancer, people with other diseases are getting substandard care simply because that dissemination hasn't happened out into the healthcare system. So I believe that there's going to be a lot of bumps in the road, but artificial intelligence is really going to improve healthcare in so many ways, and it's about time. Thank you.
Thanks, Janet. In the prep call, there was 3 things, so I added up to 5, but did a good job with all of them. So thank you. I've been writing down questions during your presentations, and I have several for everybody. So I'm going to try to pick judiciously from this and save some time for audience questions. So Stephen, I really liked your, looking at all the steps that lead up to the data that you would be tempted to just launch in and start analyzing otherwise. I also wondered about things like when you do that analysis, how do you make that not a black box where we don't know what the AI actually saw or how the AI actually decided that the patient has this or doesn't have this? How can you make it kind of a white box instead that could be queried, or how would these things be evaluated if they end up being regulated by FDA or something like that? Your thoughts about that?
How long do we have? So I'll limit my answer to large language models because other forms of machine learning do have a lot more auditability to them. So like traditional machine learning classifiers, there's a lot of research on how you can identify feature importance and those kinds of things, which can then go into help supporting interpretability in different ways. But large language models are very different. They are the ultimate black box. They are not interpretable. We don't really know how they work. Most of the research on interpretability at this point consists of either asking the model what it thinks it did, which I could talk for an hour about all the philosophical problems with that, but it's not doing what it looks like it's doing. The thing about LLMs is they will always give you an answer. Whether that answer is connected to anything relevant or real is a very different question. So if you ask it, why did you decide this? It'll give you a plausible sounding answer that has unfortunately nothing to do with the actual process by which it made the determination. So there's other work on trying to trace through the structure of the models to figure out what they're doing. But basically the short answer is we don't know. So the solution for now has to be external validation. We have to have solid ground truth data that we can use to validate the behavior of the models. and we have to be able to understand the variability in the performance, and then we have to have really good guidance on what acceptable levels of variability and performance are for different situations. And so sometimes that might mean saying no to things and not using a model for a certain thing. But you know, where that becomes a question is sort of something regulators are going to have to deal with. At least I hope they deal with, and don't just do what the industry and vendors want to do and what Congress is debating doing this week and not regulating that.
Wait, do we need interpretability? Like I think about the fellas that I train in clinic, you know, some have an experience as an internal medicine and this kind of training, some are from peds, some get this more exposure in allergy, some get immunology. In the end, they have to take a boards exam. If they pass, you know, we call it good enough.
Yeah.
We don't know where the result for checking the box C versus A came from. It doesn't matter.
Totally.
Right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
so that's where the external validation is important. Like for a specific use case,
Yeah.
if you have a system that you think you have confidence in its
Yeah.
performance. Now, where things get weird with AI models is always at the margins, right? When you have cases that are outside from the distribution that it saw during training, so rare conditions that it hasn't seen a lot, that's where the behavior is going to get the least reliable and the most unpredictable. And so then it kind of also becomes a bit of an engineering problem of how do you build these into decision-making workflows that takes that into account and makes that visible to users. The other thing to worry about there is also automation bias. There's been a fair bit of work on usability of these kinds of models, and doctors are very quick to become dependent on them and just take it as given because it's usually right.
But both of those problems occur in humans too. Like I run into the problem all the time that there are infectious disease doctors out there who think they know immunology because back in the HIV epidemic, they did one flow cytometry test and suddenly they're T-cell experts and they're totally not.
That's a good
yet,
point.
you know, they think they understand rare diseases. They say this patient doesn't have that. It can't be an immune deficiency, right? And they don't know.
They don't know, and you're right. That's a problem. But I'll say
Patients spend 10 years lingering in their clinics, waiting to get referred to our clinics and get a diagnosis.
oh, this is great. Okay. The two things I'll say to that are one, you've got a strong mental model of what kinds of things people from different specialties are likely to have issues with. And you've got a fairly good grounding in reality about why that would be.
Yeah.
And then there's ways that you can also work with them to solve that. And we don't have, we can guess, we can make up good just so stories about why we think an AI model might have said a certain thing, but we don't actually know. And that means we can't predict what's going to happen when there's a new data point. And then the second thing is the humans can be held accountable, right? You can go to the doctor and like, if a human makes a mistake or makes a mistake in judgment, we've got a whole robust framework for dealing with that and trying to prevent it as best we can with lots of systems that are based around what we know about how humans think and make decisions. None of that applies to LLMs.
Right. Well,
ahead.
I'm on your side on this. Okay. Okay. The perfect is the enemy of the good. All right. I think people are, and probably you too, okay, are in denial about how bad the healthcare system is.
Yeah, it's bad.
Okay, it's bad out there. It's really, really bad.
Fair.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, and diagnosis at least, except in an emergency situation where you got to be right the first time. Okay. Diagnosis is an iterative process. Okay. You have some clues, you do some tests, you rule out, you go back to the drawing board, you go down a little bit more, you ask more questions, maybe you have some clues from the tests and so forth. It's not, and if you have 10 years to do that, you know, you can make a lot of mistakes. Obviously, a lot of mistakes are made, or not mistakes, overlook, right? Overlook other signals.
Yeah, neglect is a mistake.
Doctors have a lot of bias, okay, because of what they're used to. And it's understandable. We all have it. Okay. You probably would diagnose maybe as a autoimmune genetic deficiency, you know, some rare infection or something sometimes, right? I would probably diagnose somebody to have lupus who actually had, you know, something else. It happens. But the key is that you keep going until the person is treated appropriately. You don't stop. So, I mean, I think that's why I'm worried about all this concern. I mean, if you come from the engineering side, you aren't used to being wrong. But in medicine, you're wrong most of the time. Okay, so we got to get over it.
Can I throw something into that though? I mean, I take your point, but also you said something in there. The LLMs are biased. This is actually very important to
Yeah.
understand. LLMs, especially ones that are trained on medical data, are going to recapitulate and reify whatever biases are in that data. So ChatGPT notoriously is enthusiastic to repeat all the things about, say, African Americans and kidney function that have been disproven for a very long time now, because that was in its training data. And it will tell you with absolute certainty that, you know, you should have a different EGF threshold for your Black patients. And we know that's not how we're supposed to like practice
Right.
anymore, but the models don't, and there's no easy way to tell them not to do it.
I
So-
have tested though, I used ChatGPT and tested on a lot of scenarios that I wrote myself personally in patient language. Okay, I can tell you it much better than doctors. You're not asking it for a diagnosis. Okay, that's the mistake. You're asking it for a differential.
Hypotheses.
A
So-
hypotheses, what kind of tests might you do? That type of thing. You're
That's
not
great.
it's not a doctor, okay? And it's like a really, really good medical literature that you don't have to go search yourself every time.
Well,
Okay, I wanted to just, but you mentioned a point earlier about accountability and liability,
Yeah.
which I don't want to lose that point. I do think, in fact, almost all medical professions will be deleted in the next few years. And instead, there'll be a new specialty called liability consultant who gets employed by, you know, these AI companies who stops up liability. Like if you want to sue, you'll sue that person and then the company will back you with insurance. But that, I mean, that's going to be the case.
That sounds
These
really
AIs
bad.
are going, why? Like there's automated truck drivers, right? Trucks driving down the road. And if they hit somebody, you have to sue someone. So
No,
there's
no,
gonna be
no.
someone sitting in the cab watching YouTube videos who stops up liability.
That's called the moral crumple zone theory of automation, and it's actually it's a thing.
Somebody has some-
But it's a
somebody
bad-
in the
bad
audience would
thing.
really like to say something.
No, wait. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
This is on, and also someone who has gone back to school to learn AI.
Mhm.
You guys are both right, but I would like, I think
Crumple zone.
Dr. Bedrick is making very, very good observations, which are if we go down one route without understanding the bias, because think of how long it took us in medicine to recognize our own biases and our models wrong. Right now, the world is changing so fast. If we don't have some guardrails on this and some understanding of the limitations of these large language models, we're going to go down the same path we already did.
Only faster.
Exactly. And harm a lot more people in the process. So I'm going to say you are both right, but I would like to have optimism for our future medical trainees and our people in medicine. And for myself, that, there is still a role for physicians and physician, training and all of that. So sorry, I just had to kind of interject.
I don't think that that AI will ever substitute for that. Okay, what it
Mhm.
will do though, we have the wrong model. We have a model, medical model from the 19th century. We only had 5 conditions like dropsy, and fever. Okay, and people could
Consumption.
remember all that. We try to train clinicians and make them understand so much knowledge. It's impossible.
No, but I think you're completely right where it can distill, because we've also created a medical system where promotion in academic centers is based on publishing,
Bingo.
not on the quality of publishing. So if we could use the large language models to distill down thousands of papers to something that is concrete that we can then use for clinical decision support in the clinic. So I do think that there are areas for these two to diverge. I just had to speak up on the large language model biases and the real concerns that come with relying too much on using them for clinical decision support right now.
I agree with you, but I would say that again is the clinician should not abdicate their responsibility. But that's not a bias, it's a habit. like
But you were
said.
just telling us that clinicians were all making the wrong decisions.
Well, just look at the data.
Well, that question had quite a life of its own.
Oh, we could go for another hour up here about that, I'm sure.
Let's see. Let's go ahead and take another audience question.
Okay, hi, Boyang Bian from Biogen. I'm trying to make I really want to discuss with the panelists here, especially hear from the physicians who are actually treating the patient and also different experts in here. Manish presented a very interesting case for early diagnosis and how to adapt in a really large health system. I'm from the industrial side. I'm working for a rare disease. I'm actually trying to develop a bunch of the algorithms for helping physician to make their decision, no matter is they don't have enough training or there has been training not good enough for this really a disease. Nobody actually have the great knowledge of it. We want to do that, but also currently we're facing the challenges. If we push something or we want to collaborate with the physician, sometimes they don't like this idea. I just wondering if this is mainly from they don't trust in the industry, or is it that have some systematically gap we haven't built up here? I'm talking about the informatics because when I reaching out to those EHR vendor, they claim they have access to the healthcare system. But on the other side, when they can promise me they can develop an algorithm, but that is not where I want to stop. I actually want this being adapted in those systems because I know physicians are buried in their jobs, their daily work. They have a 15 minutes maximum to take care of a patient, and they probably don't have enough knowledge for those disease, or after they drop their ego, they can admit that. Though then is we want to offer something can be beneficial for them, but right now is they don't want to working with us. I was just wondering from your perspective or all the panelists' perspective, what is the gap here? How we can build up this tool which can be beneficial for your side and helping patient. That is our goal here.
Go ahead. Well, I can't answer. I'm not a clinician, but I can say from an informatics standpoint that usually IT interventions, when they're not welcomed, it's usually because it doesn't fit with the workflow or doesn't have a perceived benefit to the clinician at the point of care. And so, and then at the larger level, if there's not a financial alignment with the billing capture interests of or the regulatory compliance aspects for the hospital, that's the other place things run aground. So possibly that, but also in a lot of situations, if they're using a proprietary EHR system, they might not even have the technical capability to try something new. So I wonder, so that some of those might be part of what's going on, but I need to know more to know that. But I'm curious what the actual doctors have to say.
I'll tell you, there's a fatigue that you brought up.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. And I've experienced it because I thought in my naive past that I could go to my colleagues in pulmonology and infectious disease and teach them about immune diseases and how they should pick them up and think about that. They're like, oh God, no, we have our own diseases to worry about, forget about it, right? So that's why we have an AI now to reach into their records and find our patients and say, well, we'll take it from here, right? Same thing now, if we put up an alert on a primary care, a pulmonologist's record saying, this patient might have an immune deficiency, cancel, right? They're not gonna click it, they're not even gonna read it. This patient may have sepsis, canceled, right? They're like, they don't.
Alert fatigue.
They're not at all, this is called alert fatigue. They're totally uninterested in anything but getting their work done. And that's why, and this is one of the reasons why patients spend so long before they get diagnosed, if they even get to see a doctor. As Janet mentioned, some of these patients go years and years and years with our terrible healthcare system before they even get to see a specialist. Some of my patients have been put on steroids for years before they get to see a hematologist or an immunologist, just because the primary care doc just puts them on steroids. It's good for what ails you. But yeah, this is a big problem with our health system. That's another reason why I think we will have a frontline doctor being an AI, working with a nurse practitioner, being available with like minutes of lag time, maybe hours or days. And maybe they get referred to specialists, no, you're already nodding.
no, just
nice. I love it.
Yeah,
Anyway, and I think
I don't know that you're wrong. I just don't like it.
fatigue problem. You have these AIs saying, well, you know what? This patient doesn't just have a runny nose. This person actually has something interesting. I think he needs or she needs to see an immunologist. I'm hoping for that day more than trying to train my pulmonology or frontline, peers to figure out what's an immune deficiency.
Okay, well, I think one of the things we appreciate most is the audience questions, and I see that we have both Stephen and Annette waiting there. So let's go ahead with some more audience questions.
All right. Stephen Rosenfeld, right now, North Star Review IRB, but this is not an IRB question. So this is an AI question. Is there utility in differentiating between machine learning and large language models? So I saw the stochastic parrot on the slides, and I think of large language models as ways to regurgitate what's been written, what's in the literature, all that stuff, which has a place, and they can understand our queries. But we can't really learn anything new. But machine learning is an incredibly powerful tool in medicine, and it doesn't seem we should conflate those two.
I completely agree. Within artificial intelligence, we hate the term artificial intelligence. We've been arguing like literally since the day it was invented in the 1950s. People have been complaining about what an unfortunate choice of term it is. And one of the problems is all of these things that are quite different technologies get conflated. So I even go further. I call machine learning just like fancy statistics. Like if you've done stats for epidemiology, if you know the CDC picnic example, you've done machine learning just by hand. And so I totally agree. I think LLMs need to be thought of in a different category. The different uses, different advantages, disadvantages, and the two can work together as well. I mean, at the most technical level, they are a kind of machine learning model, just not in the way that, not in a very useful way from an ontological standpoint.
But it doesn't just regurgitate what's been learned, because there is a statistical model about the ordering of words that comes from a summation of knowledge. They can come back out to you with a series of words that actually represent something new, a synthesis.
Now, my own education in computer science ended about 30 years ago. I used to program stuff, but it was like 30 years ago. So my own view of this is kind of naive. I'll throw this out and see if it gets endorsed by some of our AI experts here. Seems to me like the large language models are powerful for reading a bunch of stuff and extracting something out. Great for probably summarizing the medical record, but you might want more of some of these systems that we understand or that have different powers to interpret what's extracted out of EHRs.
I mean, depends what you mean by interpret, but probably, certainly for like prognostic models where you actually need a percentage or a probability estimate, LLMs are terrible for that. You know, but you could certainly use the output of an LLM as input into a traditional prognostic model of some kind. That's a totally legit thing to do, as long as you're thinking about errors the LLM might make and accounting for that in your analysis.
I will say what's missing, and it isn't, I'm not whoever was there, I'm not against the doctors, okay? It's the system, the system. What's missing in the system is talking to people. The large language models can talk to people, okay?
In their language.
They look like they're talking to people, but they're not actually talking to people.
I know,
There's
but
no there there.
they understand what they're doing, but they can capture what people
They look like they're talking.
say, okay?
Yes.
And they can actually translate it. They do translation very well, okay? Those are things that we don't think about because we haven't thought about the patient in this situation.
As a
Yeah.
practicing physician, I'm waiting for somebody. I know somebody could already provide this, but the hospital hasn't done it yet. I'm waiting for somebody to provide me with an AI scribe so that I can spend more time actually
Well,
talking to the.
They love the scribes. The
you know,
clinicians love the
Yeah,
scribes.
and to the question about IT adoption, I actually was at a panel the other day from a bunch of CMIOs of hospitals in Oregon, and they were talking about, you know, oh, everyone loves the scribe. It's the only innovation people ask us
Right.
to have. But then they said, but we've shown it doesn't save time. We've shown it doesn't save money. They're treating it like a physician well-being instrument. And also they talked about ways that it screws up and that the vendor changes things on them randomly and they still like it. I've never heard a health IT application that had that property described positively by users ever. So that is like the one thing that blew my mind. Scribes. Yeah, this was
Yeah,
nuanced.
they love it.
They love it.
Yes.
Well, it remains to be seen, but I would trust the doctors to judge the output of that rather than the hospital IT department, because the hospital IT departments have decades-long history of giving us terrible systems.
These were all providers who are also CMIOs. So
Yeah.
they were-
Yeah.
But you know, they may not have measured the fact that if with a scribe, you can look the person in the eye.
That's actually what they brought up. That's what they brought up as what they liked about the tool.
Well,
was they
that's-
could actually practice medicine again, even
Yeah.
though it made mistakes in the note.
Yeah, you have empathy. That is so important in medicine. You're actually talking to the person instead of looking at your screen.
Well, presumably the doctor is looking at the note before they sign it, and the AI, I believe, just from fiddling with ChatGPT, will probably get it 90% right and be a great time saver. I'm afraid we are at time.
One more question.
More question.
Go for
I
it.
had one question, and in fact, one more like a general remark after Angela spoke. I think the big thing that I've seen is that I'm not an expert in AI at all. I did one MIT class. But what I do know is that if you put the wrong question in AI, you get the completely wrong answer. So my question is, are we thinking at our medical professionals maybe in a future life as the right answer, as the right questionnaires, like the people that ask the proper questions to get to the answers, so that it is not that we don't have to fill our medical heads with encyclopedic knowledge, because that is available, but that their real skills should be understanding enough to ask the right question.
I mean, I think the right question is, as Janet said, is can you please make me a differential diagnosis? That's the starting point for a lot of our doctors. You have a complicated clinic visit. Help me with a genetic and clinical differential diagnosis is a great starting point for a lot of our fellows.
I recently faced a new patient that had 386 notes in the system, and I knew nothing about them, and I had a short period of time to talk to them. I would have loved a tool that read the 386 notes and told me what and produced a 5-page medical student H&P out of it.
Yes.
But would you
and
have loved
leave
to-
the rest up to the living doctor, I think.
Would you have loved the tool though if it missed the important note because it was one it looked like something it had never seen before, and so it didn't know what to do with it, and it ignored it because it was out of its distribution of data?
No, I wouldn't like that. That's why I asked you about the white and black boxes. Well, this is wonderful. And again, another excellent expert and passionate panel. I'm sure you can find them over the rest of the day and in the network, in the reception that's coming up.